Ready to go? Without further ado, please welcome Jerry Marzinsky.
Okay, my name is Jerry Marzinsky, and what I've been doing for the last 45 years is picking through the heads of the criminally insane and psychotic patients. You know, it's kind of like what's going on in their heads. And so I got like 8 years of higher education, and it took me years to deprogram myself. They don't call these things programs for nothing. What I hated about psychology, I was undergraduate at Temple University in psychology, is that the only course that we had that you could check out what was actually happening was abnormal or experimental psychology. So you could go into the rat lab and you can see what was going on, you know, the behavioral changes that you were expecting. But everything else, you couldn't tell. You know, you had to take their word for it. And I was raised not to trust authority. So, you know, coming up, that's kind of how I was raised. So here's these guys in the psychology program. They give you all these books, and they basically, you memorize what they have to say and you spit it back. But there was no way to check out anything that they said. You couldn't get into a mental hospital. You couldn't get into a prison. You couldn't get into a mental health center. You couldn't get into a private psychiatric center. They wouldn't let you in. They said, no, it's too dangerous. So throughout my entire 45 years, even more on the front lines of mental health, I never, ever saw a researcher on the front lines. All the research was done in the universities, and the universities were paid off by Big Pharma. So you didn't get the truth. Okay? So I'm also, in order to kind of do this stuff, I'm also an adrenaline junkie. I'm a commercial pilot. I've got more miles on motorcycles than I have in cars. I'm also a scuba diver. And you know, picking through the heads of these guys was exciting for me. It was like flying. Okay? So you know, as I went through college, there was one. It was abnormal psychology, which I really took a fascination with. But what I noticed was there were no causes for the various mental illnesses that they had in that book. No cause. They just had lists of different mental disorders and descriptions of them and what it was like. No causes whatsoever. And I thought that was kind of strange. So, you know, here's my not trusting authority kind of coming to the play already. Then the second one was that we were assigned a paper in the abnormal psychology class which said that two crazy people, if they met with the same delusion, you know, if they both thought they were Mark Carney, one of them would have to give way and change his delusion to something else. And even as an undergraduate, I'm going, why would they have to do that? You know, why would one crazy guy have to change because of another crazy guy? You know, he's got the same delusion. So fast forward 7 years, when I was at Central State Hospital, one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet, if not the biggest. And I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But I was doing rounds on the second floor of this psychiatric unit, and you know, I was watching this one guy, and what they had taught us was that the voices that schizophrenics heard were hallucinations. And I didn't know anything about it. You know, hallucinations, I figured hallucinations, there's probably word salad. When you run into a schizophrenic, he's probably talking in gibberish, you know, doesn't make any sense. But that's not what I saw in the front lines. You know, this large state hospital, there were endless supply of schizophrenics. And I was working at a psychiatric rehabilitation center, so the schizophrenics, for the most part, were the most functional, even though they weren't really functional of the bunch. And our job was to find the highest functioning of these schizophrenics out on the psychiatric units and train them in vocational skill, and then get them out of the hospital. But what I noticed is that they would always sabotage themselves. You know, as they were about to graduate, from any of the vocational classes, they would sabotage themselves. They would stop taking their medicines and they would go nuts in the classroom. They would start fights, they would get in arguments, they'd do something to get themselves thrown out of class. And I'm kind of like, why are they doing that? And they virtually all of them were doing it. You know, as they were approaching succeeding at anything, they would sabotage themselves and screw themselves over. So there was another thing I saw there, and it was like it didn't make any sense. So with this statement that this paper I read from Abnormal Psychology saying that two crazy guys who had the same delusion, one of them would have to change. So I was doing rounds on the second floor of the psychiatric unit some 7 years later, so I'm jumping ahead a long time here. And I saw this one schizophrenic talking to somebody or something I couldn't see. So I kind of snuck up behind him to kind of, what's he saying? What's his voice is saying? What's going on here? And I got up close to him, and I heard he was carrying on a coherent conversation. I mean, it wasn't word salad. He was talking to something or somebody I couldn't see. And he was carrying on a fairly heated conversation with him. So I snuck up behind him so I could hear what he was saying. And I could tell it was a coherent conversation. He was talking to somebody. It's like what it reminded me of when you hear somebody talking over a telephone. You can hear what they're saying, but you can't hear what the other person's saying to them. And I crept up behind him, and he turned around and he saw me. And I said, I'm Jerry, I'm the psych for this unit. I haven't seen you here before. When did you get here? He goes, well, I got here a couple of weeks ago. And I said, what's your name? And he tells me, he looks me in the eye and he says, I'm Jesus Christ. And then I thought back to that Abnormal Psychology article that I read about if two lunatics had the same delusion, one of them would have to give away. So I stood there and I looked him in the eye and I said, no, you're not Jesus Christ, because I am. And I stood there waiting to see what he was going to do. So is he going to change his stories? Is he going to change his hallucination like the clinical psychology people said? Or what's he going to do? So he thinks about it a while, he cocks his eyes up, and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ, and he walks off. So that fed my distrust for psychology even more. You know, it's like, can I trust anything these people are saying? So, let's see. So, I remember I was scuba diving one day. Well, I was reading in the back of this Abnormal Psychology book, and it had all these references. And it was like this guy referenced this guy, referenced this guy, referenced, and they were just referencing each other. So it was like they just took whatever each of them were saying as the truth. And I went, well, that's kind of odd. You know, how do they know the validity of what the original research was? They're just quoting each other. And I remember one time when I was scuba diving, I saw this little, it's just like this village of these little fish that made holes out of pebbles. So they were living in these little pebble houses they built. And I was down there about 50 feet, burning up a tank of air, fascinated with these little fish. So what would happen when it was like a round village, and when one of them would leave their nest to go steal a pebble from another fish, you know, then somebody would come and steal a pebble from his nest. So that they were just stealing pebbles from each other's nest, and the only fish that were bringing in new pebbles were the ones from the outside, in the periphery. And that reminded me of these references that the psychology people had in their books. It was like they were just like stealing off of each other. So I didn't trust the education, and the further I got up. So after I finished the BA in psychology, I'm like, I didn't have any real answers. I'm like, I'm looking for answers. What's going on in the mind? How does the mind work? What's going on? No answers. So I went, well, maybe they're hiding the answers in a master's degree. So I applied for a master's psychology program, got in, and learned some counseling techniques. But after I finished that, there was no answers either. So I went, well, maybe they're hiding it in the PhD program. So applied for one of the best in the nation and somehow got in there. And it was piled higher and deeper, just like they tell you, piled higher and deeper. And the professors were at each other's throats. But what really shook me up about it was when they took in all the second-year students, and the head of the psychology department wanted to talk to us all. So we all got together, and then he starts describing a research article that apparently he had done. And he's describing the normal curve, but he was describing the top 5% of that normal curve as if it were the entire population. And I was no statistical genius, but I knew that wasn't right. And I knew that certain that wasn't right. So I raised my hand and I said, now this guy was a preacher before he became a psychologist, and he was the head of the entire psychology department at this university. And I asked him, I said, well, how do you figure that? I mean, how can you describe the entire population from the top 5%? And his answer stunned me. He said, if they don't know enough about statistics to catch that, that's their problem. So basically what he was doing was teaching us all how to lie with statistics. And I was shocked. And I was absolutely shocked. I looked around at all the other students, and there was only one other student who realized what was going on, and he was shocked too. And we looked at each other and we went, and then we had to kind of straighten out our faces so we didn't get caught. But all the rest of them were sitting there going, oh, so that's how it's done. So, my trust for the formal educational system, I didn't learn anything really significant there except maybe in abnormal psychology and experimental psychology and some counseling techniques. Nothing in any of that education prepared me for getting a job at Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia. This was the biggest, if not the biggest, psychiatric hospital on the planet. There were 10,000 patients there when I arrived. Every mental illness known to man was somewhere in that place. And I was staying in the staff dorms at that time, so we were living right there. Milledgeville at that time was a small town, but the hospital was like a city. It had its own mortician, it had its own food factory, it had its own police force. There were 200 buildings there, and they sprawled well over 1,000 acres. So it was the size of a small town. It was a city of insanity. I mean, they were so. Some of the first experiences I had there was after I got hired. Well, they had 30,000 patients buried in the hospital cemetery. This place was around before the Civil War. General Sherman camped his troops on the grounds of Central State Hospital. There were still chains in the basement of the Powell building, the main building where it was the original hospital, where they used to chain these psychotic people to the walls because they had no other way of treating them. So, let me see, one of the first things I remember pulling up there was on my motorcycle, and I stopped at the intersection, and out of nowhere pops this completely naked, skinny guy running across the intersection, just trucking his way. And I'm sitting there on the motorcycle kind of going, well, I could chase him down on the bike, I could catch him. But then I'm thinking, like, what would I do with him if I caught him? There's no way I'm going to be able to get him back on the motorcycle. I had no idea where he came from. So I'm like, well, maybe just let him go. Okay. let me see, what was another one? Yeah, it was, these are before when I just got there, this was the first year or so. I was still wet behind the ears. I didn't know what was going on. I had a girlfriend who worked in one of the regressed psychiatric units, and what had happened on her unit is one patient bit the ear off another patient. And when the nurse got in the morning, here was his ear laying on her desk. And they put it in a shoebox. And then all the patients were demanding that it be given a proper funeral. So they took this ear out in the front yard of the unit. They dug a hole and they said prayers for the ear and buried the ear. So it got more bizarre from there. So I'm like, the next thing that I remember happening that I couldn't figure is one day I was walking on the first floor of the psychiatric unit, and the maintenance man was cutting, what there was a banister that went up 2 floors. It was like a hollow pipe about that big, and it ran from the first floor up to the second floor. Now I knew on the first floor the cap was off the banister. On the second floor, this maintenance man was cutting the cap off of the banister on the first floor. So that was the most exciting thing going on at the moment. So there was a bunch of patients standing there kind of watching him cut this off, and sparks were flying all over the place. There was smoke from the cutter. And we're standing there just watching the sparks, and it's like a little 4th of July. And when the cap fell off that banister, thousands of psychiatric pills came pouring out of that banister like a friggin' waterfall. They just kept coming and coming and coming like a fire hose. They spread all over the floor. And it was like, holy cow. I'm thinking each one of those is a vote by a psychiatric patient to not take their meds and to not remain sane. So I'm kind of going, do they want to be insane? Why aren't they taking their medications? And that was a puzzle. It was a puzzle for years. I later found out that the side effects of those medications are horrible. They're actually toxic. So it was not only that they were toxic, it was that the voices they were hearing them were telling them they were poison. And I'll tell you that story later. The other thing I saw was that, and I couldn't figure, so when I first saw all those pills fall out of the banister, the first thing is, well, why is that happening? Why aren't they taking it? There must have been 1,000 pills, if not more, had come out of that banister. The second thing I saw was that the psychiatric patients didn't like psychiatrists very well. So back then we had what we called a central kitchen. We didn't have cell phones in the 70s. So the grapevine was the central kitchen. And there was always, the news of what was happening on all the different units. And what I found was odd was that the psychiatrists were getting beat up at a rate higher than any other staff at the hospital. Higher than psychiatric nurses, higher than regular nurses, higher than regular doctors, higher than dentists, higher than counselors, higher than psychologists. And I'm like, why is that happening? Why are they going in? Because they were spending less time with these patients than anybody else. At the most, they'd spend 15 or 20 minutes a month with them. And I'm thinking, why? What are they doing to these patients that are getting them assaulted in 15 or 20 minutes a month? It made no sense to me. So that made sense later. So what I found is I was ending up with a lot of schizophrenics on my caseload. And they were all in vocational classes. Virtually all of them were going off their medications at some point. And I was wondering about that. So what I started doing was every time one of them got thrown out of class for not taking their meds, after they were put back on their meds and they were sane again, I would ask them, well, why did you take your meds? You you knew what was going to happen if you didn't take your meds. You knew you were going to go insane. You know, why didn't you take them? And the answer I consistently got was that the side effects were terrible, and the side effects are terrible. But that didn't make any sense in the long run. So I kept asking them, and I kept getting the same answer. So 7 years later, as I was about to leave Central State Hospital, there was one gal who was in the cosmetology class. She was doing real well. She was about to graduate. She sabotaged herself. She stopped taking her meds, and she went crazy in the cosmetology class. And she started screaming and threatening people and raising Cain, and the cosmetology teacher called me and said, "Come and get her out of here. She's driving my class crazy. I can't teach anything." So I went down there, we pulled her out, put her back on her meds again. That was the third time she'd gone off her meds. And we had a rule that if you go off your meds 3 times, you're out of the program, because we can't trust you to take your meds when they're being handed to you. You're certainly not going to take them on your own outside of the hospital. So I called her mother and let her know, okay, we're going to have to discharge her. She's not staying on her meds. This is the 3rd time. The rule is after 3 times, we have to let her go, because they proved that they're not going to take their meds. So the mother was please don't do that. I can't handle her. I'll come up there and we'll find out why she's not taking her meds. This is the first time I got an offer of any help. Trying to figure out why they weren't taking their meds. So I kind of jumped on it. You're going to help me find out why she didn't take her meds? Great, come on up. So she had to come up from South Georgia. Which was about 3 hours away from the hospital. And she came up on Friday afternoon. And I was talking to her, and then we pulled the patient in. And both of us started on this gal. Why aren't you taking your meds? This is the 3rd time. You knew you were going to get kicked out. You were about to graduate from cosmetology class. You had the certificate in your hands. You would have had a job for the rest of your life. Why did you do that? She said, "You won't believe me." I said, "Try me. I've heard and seen a lot of crazy stuff in this place. I don't think you're going to say anything that's going to throw me off." And she said, "Okay, I'll tell you." She said, "The voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me, and pointed to the side effects of those medications, proving as a proof that I was being poisoned." And in a way, it was true. Those side effects of those medications are very toxic. I've got a list on here somewhere. Well, it's stuff like akinesia. It's this uncontrollable shaking. They feel dumbed out. They feel like zombies. They can't think straight. Here's one for, this is the side effects of antidepressants. Most of them were on antidepressants. Nausea, diarrhea, constipation, loss of appetite, blurred vision, dizziness, drowsiness, fatigue, dry mouth, agitated breathlessness, headaches, sexual dysfunction, sleep problems, increased blood pressure, stomach aches, increased sweating, lightheadedness, tremors, trouble sleeping, dizziness, anxiety, headache, diarrhea, fatigue, and that's just with antidepressants. The antipsychotics are much worse. Uncontrolled muscle movements, akinesia, lip smacking, it's like tongue darting, stiffness in your neck, tightness in your throat, trouble breathing, lightheadedness, feeling like you might pass out, confusion, agitation, feeling jittery, weakness, breast swelling or discharge, seizures, jaundice, low white blood cell count, fever, mouth sores, skin sores, drowsiness, dry mouth, stuffy nose, constipation, and that's only a fraction of it. Okay? So what they were saying about, oh yeah, I'm not taking them because of the awful side effects, it's true. Now, when the voices start telling them that, hey, the psychiatrist is poisoning you, and that these side effects are poisonous, or the effects of this poison they're giving you, and they're feeling all this stuff, they come to believe that they're being poisoned. That accounted for virtually all the attacks on psychiatrists throughout the institution. Virtually all of those attacks on psychiatrists were by schizophrenics. And I could surmise from what I found that the voices were telling them, you're being poisoned by the psychiatrist. Okay? So I'm kind of wondering, what are these voices? And nobody was interested in the voices. So it's the chief symptom of schizophrenia. And not a single staff member in that entire hospital with many hundreds of staff were interested in finding out what these voices were and what they were saying. They were programmed in school to believe that the voices were hallucinations, and they just went with it. You know, there was no research whatsoever on what these voices were of any kind. It's like the psychiatrists and the psychiatric mafia just went, we hereby declare that these voices are hallucinations, and that's the way it is. So it got into the books, it got into teaching it in the universities. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. It's just what they say. Right? So I started getting curious about what are these things? Because it was clear that they were driving their behavior. That schizophrenics who were listening to those voices were doing stupid, crazy stuff. You know? So I started asking them, you know, what are the voices telling you? And one of the patients was listening to his voices at the time, and the voices said, he already knows too much, don't tell him anything more. You know, that was down the line a little bit after I figured out what these things were. So the first pattern I saw, so if they're hallucinations, they don't run patterns. Hallucinations don't run patterns. You can't predict what a hallucination is going to do. The first pattern I saw these things running was they were consistently negative. They were derogatory, they were insulting, they were abusive, they were destructive. They might have acted like they were friendly at first, and then they turn on the person. And they say stuff like, you're no good, you're rotten, you're ugly, you're stupid, nobody likes you, you're worthless, you just go ahead and kill yourself. And this was consistent. You know, so I talked to scores of schizophrenics. This was the first pattern that appeared. So I'm like, they run patterns? So I'm like, okay. You know, and it took a while for the schizophrenics to get comfortable to speaking to somebody, to a psych person, because our job was to watch these out of hand, to turn them into the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist would drug them. Okay? So the main controlling influence in this hospital and in all hospitals were psychiatric drugs. So when they hit you with these antipsychotics, which are major tranquilizers, crazy people don't feel like doing anything. They're drugged up. You know, they don't get violent, they don't get upset. But that pissed off the voices, I found out later. The voices didn't like those drugs because it weakened them. They didn't want to be weakened. The second trait that appeared was that these voices were anti-religious. They didn't like the patient reading the Bible. They didn't like them going to church. They didn't like them saying prayers. They didn't like them having anything to do with preachers. They didn't like them going to church. So I found that interesting. I'm like, why would a hallucination be anti-religious? So I started asking more and more questions about that. And what I found is that if the voices were very weak, and the schizophrenic went into a church, the voices would generally shut up. They would go quiet. If the voices were moderate in strength, they would get louder in the church and they would block out what the preacher was trying to say. So they would get louder so the patient couldn't hear anything other than these screaming voices, that would interfere. If the voices were very strong, the patient would actually jump up and run out of the church. So I'm like, well, that's interesting. So there was a fella in Northern California, Dr. Wilson Van Dusen. He was a clinical psychologist, and he was also a Swedenborgian. So Swedenborg was a Christian mystic who lived some 300 years ago, and he wrote about heaven and hell. And what Van Dusen saw was that the demons that Van Dusen was describing in hell were very similar to the voices that his psychiatric patients were hearing. So I read Van Dusen's book, and I saw the same thing he did. After studying a little bit of Swedenborg, they were right on. The description of what Swedenborg called demons was virtually identical with what these voices, how they were reacting. Okay? And then the anti-religious stuff. So one thing Van Dusen did that was interesting, he would always call them hallucinations because he didn't want to get in trouble with his colleagues, his other clinical psychologists. So he tried to treat them as friends, to try to find out what they were. And he said they were a little bit afraid of him, they didn't trust him. But he got one patient to separately take a Rorschach and an MMPI. And the MMPI is like the gold standard for psychological tests. And he ran those tests on the voices alone and on the patient, and found that the voices were more psychotic than the patient was. But his findings with Swedenborg, I read Swedenborg stuff and he was right on. The voices were very similar to the demons that Swedenborg was describing. And I didn't believe in demons, I'm like, oh, well, I don't know, I wasn't totally convinced of it. But then one day, one of the patients came to my office and we were talking. He said, the voices came last night and I repeated the 23rd Psalm, and he said they howled like they were being tortured. He said that they acted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, why would they do that? So I started passing out the 23rd Psalm to all my other patients that were schizophrenic and said, when the voices come, read this Psalm and let me know what happens. The voices reacted horribly every single time. They got louder, they got more agitated, they hated that Psalm. And that was consistent. And this was over dozens of patients that I gave it to. So these things are anti-religious, They hate the 23rd Psalm, they hate the Lord's Prayer, they hate any kind of religion. And I'm like, why would a hallucination be anti-religious? Third pattern I found is that they create and foster and create negative emotion. So what they were saying was always negative. You're no good, you're stupid, you're worthless, you're ugly. And this is going on constantly. So it's like the intrusive thought in your head that just keeps telling you these awful things about yourself 24 hours a day. They would come late at night. After the sun went down, they got louder. They got loudest between 3 and 4 in the morning. And they were relentless. They would not let up. You're stupid, you're ugly, you're crazy, everybody hates you. Your mom and dad don't like you. They're just faking like they like you. Your girlfriend's cheating on you, your husband's cheating on you, your wife's cheating. Everything negative you can think of. Nothing positive. Second pattern. And so here's 2 patterns now. So hallucinations don't run patterns. They're random. You can't predict what a hallucination is going to run. And here's a psychiatric mafia teaching in all their universities. These hallucinations are auditory hallucinations due to a broken brain. Something's wrong with your brain, there's a chemical imbalance, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're helpless. The only thing you can do is take these toxic drugs. So what they did constantly is they fostered and created negative emotion. So I would talk to the patients after the voices came and ask them, how'd you feel before the voices came and how'd you feel after the voices came? Consistently, they reported that every time the voices came, that they were drained of energy. One guy said, I felt like I was working out in the hot Georgia sun all day with a pickaxe, and I was that exhausted. And I'm like, well, you know, how could that be? You were just laying in your bed all night. How could you be that exhausted? Because I was. So I started checking into that and asking these other schizophrenic patients, how do you feel after the voices show up? How do you feel after they leave? Virtually all of them said, I feel worse, I'm weaker, I don't have any energy after they leave. And this was consistent among scores of schizophrenics. After the voices attacked, they had no energy left. Now, they were feeling so bad that they didn't really notice that, because you know, your brain is all scrambled, you got these voices screaming at you, you feel bad, you don't have any sleep. The voices did not want them to sleep. They wanted them awake all the time because they were getting weaker and weaker as they were losing sleep. So they couldn't resist the voices as well. And the voices didn't want resistance, they wanted control. So what I did at one point, I just made it was a little experiment, 1 to 10. How much energy did you have before the voices came? How much energy did you have after the voices came? Every single one of them reported that they had less energy after the voices came than they did before. And so these things were draining these patients. They were taking their energy. And this was consistent, again, among scores of patients, and now it's hundreds. And they didn't notice that because they were so messed up in the first place. But when I mentioned it, they went, oh yeah, now, yeah, I know now. And before I told them what was going on, I'd say, well, listen, you've heard these voices thousands of times over your lifetime, and each time you heard them, your energy level dropped. What do you think took your energy? 90% of them would go, I don't know. And I went, well, if you stuck your hand in a fire 1,000 times, and every time you got burned, what was burning you? You didn't have any trouble with the fire. So I went, well, okay, you've heard these voices thousands of times, and every time they came, your energy was drained. Where do you think it went? And still, most of them would go, well, I don't know. The voices didn't want them to know that they were parasites. So the last 10 years of working for other people, I have my own practice now, but I was working psych crisis in all the major hospitals all over Tucson. And what I was thinking is like, the hospital didn't want you working with patients in the emergency room. They just wanted you to get them out because the doctors didn't know what to do with crazy guys, and they were just disruptive. They didn't know how to treat them. They didn't know what to do with them, so they just wanted them out of there. So I couldn't spend a lot of time with them there. But what I thought is, what could I tell them that would help them the most when they get out of here? And there were two things. One is that the voices aren't hallucinations, and the second thing was that they're parasites. I had to be very careful with that because while I was working, while I was at the state hospital, one of the psychiatrists found out that I was asking patients what these voices were and what they were telling them and what they were doing and how they reacted to stuff. And I got pulled to that patient, I guess he got ticked off, or his voices got ticked off, and he complained to one of the psychiatrists. The next morning, I ended up in the psychiatrist's office in front of this psychiatrist who's going, the voices are hallucinations. You need to know that. You know, don't be asking questions about them, because what you're doing is you're reinforcing the hallucinations and you're making the patient worse. You know, and you keep asking them questions about their voices, you're gonna be disciplined. And I'm like, I was pissed. Because by then I knew these voices weren't hallucinations. I didn't know what they were, but they were running patterns. I knew they weren't hallucinations. That happened twice while I was at the state hospital. So the psychiatrist didn't want you asking any questions about what the voices were. They had no idea what they were themselves, other than hallucinations, what they had been brainwashed to believe. So I had to fly under the radar. I didn't stop asking questions, but I had to be very careful. It really slowed me down. So by the time I left the state hospital 7 years later, after asking schizophrenics hundreds, if not thousands of questions, I knew these voices were consistently negative. They didn't ever say anything good. They were malicious. They were nasty. They were anti-religious. They fostered and created negative emotion. They drained the energy out of these people. And later I found out they got louder after sunset. And so the schizophrenics would hate when the sun went down, because the voices would get louder. So after I left the state hospital, I went to a PhD program for a couple of years, and it was just, I couldn't deal with it. After 2 years, it was like I had to hit the ejection seat. It was just nonsense. They were fighting with each other. There was nothing clinically relevant. They were making us memorize the DSM, which is their Bible, which, by the way, is completely made up. This big Bible of psychiatric illnesses. There's not one objective test to verify any of right now there's almost 300 diagnoses in there. Okay? There's not one objective test to verify even one of them. It's all subjective, based on a psychiatrist's opinion. Okay? And I'm going to call Dr. Kaufman in a little while. He's the only psychiatrist in the bunch here. So he knows. I met him a good while ago, and we just hit it off because we think the same. Okay? So what I did on the energy thing, I think I left this out. I collected all this data, like 1 to 10, before, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much energy did you feel you had before the voices came? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much energy did you feel you had after the voices left? Okay. Consistently, all of them said, I had more energy before the voices came. After the voices left, I had less energy. I felt awful. We ran an analysis of variance on that, and it was statistically significant. This is the kind of stuff that psychiatry and the universities are not going to do, because they think these things are hallucinations. So it went on and on. So after I had left the PhD program, I came to Tucson. I was working in a mental health center, and then I ended up working in the emergency room of the county hospital. From there, I went to the psychology department in a large state prison in Tucson. So lo and behold, I was, at the time I left, I was like fed up with schizophrenics. It's like they make no sense. They're driving me crazy. I don't know what's causing this. I don't have a handle on it. I don't have enough answers. And I was glad to get away from it. So in the mental health center, I was working with substance abusers. In the county hospital, I was doing psych crisis, so it was all kinds of mental illnesses, not just schizophrenia. Then in the prison, what I found is that the prison was full of schizophrenics. So what they did in the 70s, they started closing down all the mental hospitals across the United States. This was Proposition 13 in California. They were rebelling against the high taxes. So they went, okay, well, let's just close down the mental hospitals. So they go, well, we're gonna set up mental health centers and we'll have psychiatrists working there. They can come into the mental health centers. That was insane. They wouldn't even pick up their meds when they were handed to them. They tucked them under their tongues and they would spit them out in the toilet where the nurse couldn't see them. They weren't taking their meds. Consistently non-compliant. So if they weren't taking their meds when they were being handed to them, they certainly weren't going to take them when they were expected to find transportation to a mental health center and then go to that mental health center and wait in line for these things, sometimes for a long time. It just wasn't going to work. I knew it wasn't going to work. But they were going, oh yeah, they need to be around a more normal population. Well, you see the more normal population they're around now. They're on the street corners everywhere. You know, most of those guys who are on the street corners begging for money or food are hearing voices or they're drug addicts. Okay? So that's where they are now. You know, they're out there starving half to death. And what are they supposed to do? You know, you release them. They no longer have a place to live. They no longer have people giving them their medicine. They don't have any food. They can't hold a job. What are they going to do? They're going to rob people or they're going to sell drugs. So they end up in the prison. So the prison was full of schizophrenics. So here I was on again. You know, it's like, what's going on with these things? But the big difference in the prison is I didn't have a psychiatrist sitting over me going, don't be asking these people questions. You know, and if they went to tell the warden, if they went and complained to the warden, hey, the psych is asking me questions about my voices, and I don't like it, he's upsetting me. The whole system is set up for upset people. It was the perfect place to study the voices. I no longer had to hide from the psychiatrist. I no longer had to worry about upsetting these guys. So what I did is I got around me a group of 10 to 15 schizophrenic patients who were willing to tell me in real time what the voices were telling them as we were talking. The voices didn't like me very much. You know, they were, you know, this guy's crazy, he's stupid, don't come to a meeting, don't talk to him, don't tell him about us. We will make things hard for you if you keep talking to this guy. And they did. But what amazed me is that they kept coming, even though the voices made things hard for them, even though the voices were screaming at them all the way to my office and telling them, don't go, don't come, don't talk to this guy. They came anyway. So what I had is a group of schizophrenics who would tell me in real time what the voices were telling them. Okay? And these patterns kept coming. So, and you can see, anybody who's working with schizophrenics can check this out for themselves. So I'm going to kind of scan through these real quick. So the voices got louder after sunset, consistently. They liked when the sun went down, and the patient was always like, oh no, the sun's going down again. Yeah. They would get loudest consistently between 3 and 4 in the morning. They'd wake the patient up and they would not allow him to go back to sleep. They would start on him, you're stupid, you're ugly, you're crazy, and just go on and on and on and saying it. And then they would suck that energy off them so they had no energy to fight back. I remember sitting in the psychiatrist's office one time with one of my patients, and he was telling the psychiatrist, well, he was complaining about the voices. He goes, the voices, I can't handle the voices, you know, so the psychiatrist, what they would do in that case would be they'd either increase their meds, they'd add more meds, or they'd change the meds. It was all about the meds. You didn't see any of them talking to these patients about, well, what are they saying? What are they hearing? You know, their background, you know, how did this happen? When did it start? Nothing like that. It was all about the meds. Okay, well, increase your meds. So the patients would lie to them. They didn't want more meds. They were already feeling like zombies. They were already shuffling. They had what they called at the state hospital the Thorazine shuffle. And these meds were actually destroying their brains. With long-term use, these patients would develop the Thorazine shuffle, so they would just kind of shuffle along. It wouldn't be a normal gait. They'd drag their feet along the floor because of the neurological damage. So what these drugs did long term is it would actually shrink their brain and destroy their peripheral nervous system. So it was doing physical damage. These meds were toxic, they were poisonous, and never once did I hear a psychiatrist warn these patients about the dangerous side effects of these meds. They just went, oh yeah, your sight will get blurred, you might slur your speech a little bit, you'll have dry mouth, you'll feel sedated for a while. It was just all the very common effects, but they never went into the toxic effects of these drugs. They never told them that. And what was even more heinous is when they started showing those toxic effects of these drugs, instead of reducing the drugs, the psychiatrist would add clonazepam to mask the negative effects of those drugs. So they weren't feeling it. So their brains were being destroyed, the peripheral nervous system was being destroyed, and they weren't feeling any of the effects because they were drugged up by another drug. That reminds me of another treatment that they were doing at that hospital. These were shock treatments, okay? And I heard of shock treatments, but I never saw one. So I'm sitting in my office one day, and a friend of mine who worked in another psychiatric unit calls and goes, hey, Dr. So-and-so's doing a shock treatment over here for students in about a half hour. Come on over here, you can see it. I never saw a shock treatment before. So I went, okay, I'll be there. I showed up, and here's this, looked like a Cuban psychiatrist. They didn't have the highest quality psychiatrists at the state hospital. And here's this group of students around this gurney, and there was a wooden box with dials on it, and it had some meters on it. And here's these wires that hung off it, and these metal plates about this big. And here's the psychiatrist talking about the machine. And then the students are asking him some questions, and he tells the nurse, okay, bring in the patient. So out of one of the side doors comes two big nurses and this little skinny, shriveled up old lady, just kind of walking like this between them, just little tiny thing. She looked like she came out of a concentration camp too. And it looked like she knew the drill. She walked right up to the gurney where they would lie down to get the shock treatment. And it was like she just did it automatically. Like, okay, I know the routine. And so they started messing with the electrodes, and I saw the psychiatrist put jelly on the electrode. And I asked him, hey doc, why the jelly on the electrode? And he said, well, that increases the connection. He said, if we didn't put this jelly on the electrodes, it would actually burn the patient's skin. And I'm like, whoa. So they put those electrodes on the side of her head, and they strapped them down. Okay, so they're tight to the side of her head. One on one side, one on the other. And then they start strapping her down. And I'm like, why are you strapping her down? And they're like, oh, well, if we didn't strap her down, she'd jump right off of this gurney and she'd just be up to the ceiling. And I'm like, what? And you go, oh yeah, we have to strap her down. And they were not just strapped, they were really strapping her down. There were like straps on the wrists, straps on the forearms, straps on the ankles, on the legs, on the body. There were straps all over. She wasn't going nowhere. And I'm like, well, that's awful strange. What are they going to do to this poor lady? And so then he gets out this big needle, and that thing must have been that big around and this long. And it was full of this milky white fluid. So I'm watching this, and the doctor finds the vein, and he sticks this big horse needle in there, and I asked him, I said, well, that's the biggest needle I've ever seen. What's in there? And he goes, it's a muscle relaxer. And I said, well, why are you giving her a muscle relaxer? Well, if we didn't give her a muscle relaxer, her bones would break when we gave her the shock. And I'm like, what? And he didn't just squeeze the milky fluid in. He threw some blood in there. He's mixing it with blood back and forth, back and forth, back and forth before he puts it in. I'm watching that going, well, what's going on here? And so he gives her that, and she's just laying there, she's out of it. And then he keeps talking, and finally he says, okay, I'm not ready to get the electroshock. Stand away from the gurney because we don't want you guys getting shocked. So all the students move back, and they're standing there looking, and then he goes, okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, and he hits the shock button, and she just was all over the place. I mean, it felt like she was going to come out of those straps. And this went on for, it seemed like forever. And I'm like, when's he going to shut it off? Well, finally, he shuts it off. And then he goes on blabbering, and he's talking to the students. It was like he was in some sideshow somewhere, and he was the main actor. And I'm looking at this poor lady, and she's turning blue. She's cyanotic. She's dead. She's on her way to death. And I went, hey, Doc, she's turning blue. She's cyanotic. And he goes, like as an afterthought, he grabs these 2 electrode things, he puts it on her chest, and he gives her another shock when she jumps, and then the color starts coming back. She almost died on that gurney. And by the time she was done, I turned around, and I almost fainted. I held on to this big, and I got a pretty strong stomach. I held on to this big pillar, and I'm like, never want to see anything like that again. And they were given 3,000 of those every year. Each and every one were destroying the person's brain. And neurologists told me that they could see the damage that each one of those did time after time. And it wasn't, a lot of times, it wasn't the psychiatrist who determined who was going to get these shock treatments. It was either the nurse or the attendant on these wards. If the patient was acting out and was in too much trouble, they would give these guys a shock. They tell the psychiatrist, well, this guy needs a shock treatment. So in a lot of cases, it was being used as a punishment. 3,000 a year of what I just described to you. This was their cutting-edge treatment for virtually anything. Psychosis, depression, whatever. They didn't understand it till they figured it shocked. But I have to admit that sometimes for a week or 2 weeks after the shock, the voices went away. That was that. That's one of their cutting-edge treatments at the state hospital. So other patterns I found, the voices got louder after sunset. Why would I hallucinate? There was one time I was in the office of a psychiatrist with the patient, and he was complaining about his voices. And the doctor said, okay, I'll increase your meds and all that, this and that. And but the patient said, well, what do I do about the voices? He said, oh, just ignore them. They're hallucinations, just ignore them. So a week later, I called that patient back to my office and said, how'd that work for you? Ignoring the voices. He said, it didn't work at all. They will not be ignored. So I started asking other patients, when you ignore the voices, what happens? In all cases, they got louder. So here's another pattern. They foster self-destructive behavior. They're always telling the patient to behave in self-destructive ways. Conflict, turmoil, sufferings. They sabotage themselves. They're getting in fights. They're telling them bad things about other people. So they're actually, they do not want these people to succeed in anything. They foster isolation. They want the patient to be alone by himself, where the voices just have complete access to them, with no interference. So anybody who tries to help the patient is an enemy. Mothers, fathers, the voices get crazy, and they drive these parents nuts. And the patient goes, well, just leave me alone in my room. And the parents are like, oh, thank God, I got some respite from this guy. That's exactly what the voices want. They don't want any interference with what they're telling these patients to do. And what they're telling them to do is not good. To attack other people, to cut themselves, to kill themselves, to destroy this, destroy that. It's always negative, destructive stuff. They demand the attention of the victims consistently. They maneuver for complete control over the victims. They don't often get it. but there is one where I actually saw that the patient was completely controlled by those things. This was in the emergency room at the county hospital when I was doing site crisis. They drug in this was a Muslim guy, and his family moved from Phoenix to Tucson and left him behind with his girlfriend. And he was hearing voices, and his father drug him in and told me the story of what was going on. So I called the girlfriend to get her side of the story, and what she said was he was getting more and more psychotic. She was afraid of him. He wouldn't listen to anything she said. So she would lock her bedroom door at night, and he would pace the floor all night, just pacing back and forth, talking to these voices. So she was intimidated. And one day about 3 in the morning, he got up and he turned the lights on and he went outside the apartment, and he went out to the middle of the lawn out there, and he had a big butcher knife with him. And he kneeled down on the grass and he started stabbing the grass with his butcher knife over and over and over again. And his girlfriend's sitting at the window watching this, and she goes, "Oh my God," she locks the door and calls the police. So he gets done stabbing the grass and tries to get in. She wouldn't let him in. And she said, "You better get out of here, the police are coming." So eventually he ran. His father sent him money to come to Tucson. He was completely convinced that he wasn't who he used to be. So he might have been Muhammad or something like that. And anybody who called him Muhammad, he would get furious. He would say, "I'm not Muhammad, I am Jack. Muhammad is dead." You know. And he was living with his family. He was off medications, and every time his father called him by his right name that he was born with, Muhammad, he would get mad, and finally he assaulted his father for calling him Muhammad. He kept insisting, "I'm not Muhammad, I'm Jack Smith," or whatever it was. "I'm not, Muhammad is dead." You know, and his family's like, "What's going on with this guy?" You know? So after he assaulted his father, his brother beat the crap out of him and threw him in his room and said, "If you come out of there, I'm going to give you more of the same." But he kept acting the same way. Every time anybody called him Muhammad, he would go nuts, and he would say, "I'm not Muhammad, quit calling me Muhammad." Then finally he started telling him, "This is my house, you get out, this is my place." You know? So finally they drove him to the ER, and I saw him there, and sure enough, he didn't believe that he was who he used to be. He believed that he was Jack Smith or something like that. And I'd ask, "Well, when was Muhammad born?" He'd give me some date, and I'd ask, "Well, when was Jack Smith born?" And he'd give me another date. So he actually believed he was somebody else. So he was completely taken over, and it was very dangerous. So I recommended that he'd be admitted, and he was. So what these things do is they maneuver for complete control. They want more and more control over the victim. And they don't stop. They get as much as they can. They gaslight the victim. I had one patient where he was hearing voices. The voices were telling him that he murdered somebody. He didn't know whether he did or not. He was so confused. So he thought about, well, if I murdered somebody, I ought to go turn myself into the police department. And if I do that, they're going to lock me up on a sideboard, so I better not do that. And every time he heard a siren, a police siren or an ambulance or something, the voices would tell him, "They're after you, they're coming after you, they're looking for you, that's them now, they're coming to get you right now." So they gaslight the patient. These things are intelligent. You know, they're evil intelligent, but they're intelligent. They have different degrees of intelligence. Some of them are very stupid, some of them are so sly. It is incredible how sly and cunning they are. They manipulate perception. So schizophrenic might be walking down the street, and a group of guys on the other side of the road crack a joke and they start laughing. The voices tell them they're laughing at you. You know, ideas of reference. You know, people are looking at you, people are mocking you, they're thinking bad things about you. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory. So they can go in there and they can pull up every rotten thing the schizophrenic did. And they can rub it in their face until they turn negative again. They demand that the victim not tell anybody about their presence. So they don't want the victim to tell their family or anybody else about what the voices are saying. Matter of fact, the voices get punished if they're found out. And that's what that one case I was telling you about earlier, where I was asking the patient about his voices. And the voices came out and said, don't tell him anything more, he already knows too much. And that's odd for a hallucination. So here these patterns go on and on. The voices are constant liars. They lie about everything. You can't believe anything they say. So I asked the schizophrenics, I said, if you know they're liars, don't you? He goes, yeah, I know they're liars. Well, if they're liars, why do you listen to them? They said, because they're so damn convincing. So a colleague of mine came up with something called the That's a Lie program that works great. They respond to the voices. Every time they hear the voices telling them something, they go, that's a lie. And if they don't believe anything the voices are saying, they don't have control over you. They lose all control. You have to believe what they're saying for them to have control over you. They steer the person away from anything that's pleasant, that might generate joy or happiness. They don't want the patient to be happy. So you can see these things are evil. They're nasty. They can manipulate feeling without speaking. So the schizophrenic could be sitting there just minding his own business. All of a sudden he feels horrible. He feels this deep depression coming over him. They short-circuit reason. So reason is not effective anymore. They try to pass themselves off as the victim's thoughts. And this is where they hit each and every one of you. It doesn't, not just the schizophrenics who get hit by these things. All of you have had consistent or persistent, they call them intrusive, negative intrusive thoughts. And that doesn't belong to you. It's coming in from outside of you. So the last one I remember was, you might have seen that big white dog walking around out here with my wife. There's one day in Arizona, Tucson, we cut down the cactus. We don't have, many people don't have lawns there. So here I was out in the backyard with a machete chopping cactus. And along comes my dog running by, and I had the machete in my hand, and here's this thought barges in my head and says, chop her head off. And I'm standing with a machete in my hand with that thing, and I went, what the frick, And it was like, I knew what it was. It was them. How many of you have stood on a bridge and went, I wonder what it would be like to jump over, or I wonder what it would be like to jump to drive into oncoming traffic. Those are all intrusive thoughts, and they're put there by these very same entities. And none of you would act on that stuff. The people who are more unstable would. Matter of fact, a lot of these schizophrenics who commit these horrible crimes, they say, I don't remember doing it, because they didn't do it. The voices put them up to it. And after it's done, they go, what happened? They destroy positive self-conflict. They move the person away from consensual reality, so the reality we all know or operate from. These guys are in a different reality that's not a good one. They have aversion to anything positive or beautiful. And the voices don't like the person knowing that they're parasites. So one of the things I could tell these patients in the emergency room that I thought I could trust, and I didn't tell all of them, was that these things are not human and that they're parasites. And there was one gal that I told, I said, when's the last time you heard the voices? She said, about an hour ago. And I said, well, I'm going to tell you something in about 30 seconds, and they're going to start screaming. I said, I'm not going to be in your way. If you need to leave the office, the door's open, I'm not going to stand in your way. You go out until you calm down, and then I'll get with you later. So, I told her, okay, these things are they're parasites. Yeah, how do you feel after they come? No energy. She jumps up and she gets very agitated, and she runs for the door, and then tries to get into the bathroom. She can't get into the bathroom. She starts running around the day room. The voices were very agitated. If you want to set them off, what you do is tell the patient that these things are parasites. That's the last thing they want them to know. So, those are kind of the patterns. Now, I got more stuff, but it's got more to do with psychiatry. And I think I've been talking for now, I don't know, what is it? 9 to 10, an hour and a half. I was going to invite Dr. Andrew Kaufman up here, who's a psychiatrist. I don't know if you guys want to take a little break before we start again, or do you want to just go? Okay, good. Take a 15-minute break.
Get tickets to this year's event at internationaltruthexpo.com.